Jackie Chan burst onto the big screen throughout the 70s, with his ridiculous stunts, his martial arts, and his parkour. Wait a second, that can't be right, because parkour wasn't invented until the 90s in France. And this is Jackie Chan in China in the 70s. In today's video, we're going to explore the often overlooked connection between parkour, Jackie Chan, and martial arts. Let's go. If you type into Google who invented parkour, the first name that will come up is David Bell. David Bell captured the world's attention throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, with his incredible movement that was featured in films, television, and commercials. David, Sebastian Foucan, and the Yamakasi would often be filmed leaping across rooftops, climbing up buildings, and taking disgusting height drops.
Ils ne l'ont peut-être pas voulu, mais ils ne l'ont.
David pretty much showed the world a brand new discipline that had never been seen before. But why did David Bell start launching himself off rooftops in the first place? What gave David his inspiration? Was it that David Bell had just seen a few Jackie Chan films and wanted to be like him? Well, the best place to find the answer to that question is in this book right here, Breaking the Jump by Julie Angel. The secret story of parkour's high-flying rebellion. Sounds pretty intense. Throughout this book, Julie Angel details how parkour came about, and in this book we start to get a fuller picture of what exactly inspired David Bell. In the book, Julie states that David and his group, the Yamakasi, were heavily inspired by Bruce Lee. She goes as far as to credit Bruce Lee as the unofficial president of their club. But on top of Bruce Lee, it lists a few other names. Jean-Claude Van Damme, the characters from Dragon Ball, and most importantly to our story, Jackie Chan. Chan's movements and use of the environment was creative, unique, daring, and unbelievably coordinated. In fact, if we just search the word Chan, we can see that he is referenced at least 5 times throughout this book, where Julie explains Jackie's influence, both direct and indirect, on the Yamakasi. But before we talk more on that, I want to find out how Jackie Chan became who he is. Just quickly, I wanted to say Tom over at Vite Ramen has been saying I should make this video for ages. So massive thanks to Vite Ramen for sponsoring this video and making it happen. Vite Ramen are a quick and easy nutritional ramen noodle. They take just 3 minutes to cook and they are crammed with loads of nutrients. Each pack has up to 31 grams of protein and 25% of your daily values for your vitamins and minerals. Vite Ramen are a long-time sponsor of this channel and genuinely they've become like my go-to meal when I'm editing. They're just a really easy way for me to eat healthily when I'm sitting around for 10 hours straight editing a video. So be sure to go and get yourself some, it massively helps out the channel every time you buy one. Use the code JimmyTheGiant10 for 10% off. Anyway, back to the video. Prior to Jackie Chan, throughout the 70s, China was starting to open up its economy to the rest of the world. A whole new genre of what is kung fu films were being created in Hong Kong. And most of the major films were coming from 3 brothers, called the Shaw Brothers. Their films focused on intense acrobatics and violence. These films became super popular all across Eastern Asia. But over time, the ambition to tackle the Western market would grow. The Shaw Brothers wanted their films to be popular in the West, and you can see that in how their logo just rips off the Warner Brothers logo. So the American-born Bruce Lee became the hero of many of these films. Bruce Lee was propelled into stardom and made martial arts a global trend, far beyond China and just Eastern Asia.
Be formless, shapeless, like water. Be water, my friend.
Kung fu films, video games, TV shows were literally everywhere. Bruce Lee just had this distinct style of kung fu. Every kung fu practitioner wanted to be like Bruce Lee. In 1972, we would be introduced for the very first time to a young man named Jackie Chan. In the Bruce Lee film, Fists of Fury. And then again in 1973 in Enter the Dragon. As this now very mainstream genre of kung fu films were going from strength to strength, tragedy struck.
On the 20th of July, 1973, all of the newspapers in Hong Kong carried shock headlines: the death of Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee had left a massive void to fill. and Jackie Chan was expected to fill that void. Jackie's stage name was then changed to Cheng Long, which translates literally to become the dragon. Bruce Lee was known as the Dragon. So in the eyes of much of China and Hong Kong cinema, Jackie Chan was expected to become Bruce Lee. He had the pressure of the entire industry expecting him to carry on Bruce Lee's legacy. With all that weight on his back, pressure mounted for Jackie Chan's first ever solo film. But despite Jackie Chan's best efforts, the film flopped and his attempt to become the dragon was unsuccessful. But you see, the thing is, the Jackie Chan we saw in these early films isn't the Jackie Chan we know now. There was no comedy, there was no parkour, just pure martial arts. The Jackie Chan that the world knows and loves didn't really happen until 1978, with the film The Snake in the Eagle's Shadow. This film was groundbreaking at the time. Jackie Chan had complete freedom to do what he wanted with the stunt work, which was a big deal because stuntmen didn't have that luxury back then. They just did what they were told. But what's even more shocking than that is the fact that Jackie Chan broke away from the lineage of Bruce Lee. From my understanding, in Chinese culture, it's very rare that you would ever break a lineage. The aim for most martial artists is to emulate and pay homage to the legends of the past. But despite that, Jackie Chan jumped onto the big screen with his now iconic style of comedic kung fu. In these films, we'd see a style of physical comedy, or action comedy you could call it. This was a type of comedy that was expressed through the way that Jackie moved. This unique style of movement captivated the entire world. Jackie had this ability to channel character and emotion into his movement. He could leave you in hysterics without saying a word. Jackie's expressive comedic style would utilize the environment around him. Falling off things, climbing up things, jumping off things, Jackie Chan did it all. And what's more is he did all of this without any ropes, and very little if no camera trickery. It was all real. This, of course, effectively led Jackie Chan to breaking every bone in his body.
I have a hole in my head. Oh, hell no.
As Jackie Chan had become very successful in the West, and China had started to become more modern, Jackie's films would start to focus less on rural China and more so on urban city environments. The fighting on tables or falling off of thatched roofs was starting to be replaced with scaling up and down roller coasters, billboards, or climbing up buildings. This change in environment bred a new style that arguably could be called parkour. So how did Jackie discover this style? Did he invent it? I actually found it surprisingly hard to find Jackie talk about his inspirations, but I did find one news article. In an interview with New York Times, Jackie Chan explained his inspirations. Harold Lloyd, Charlie Chaplin, and Buster Keaton. I think he's the best. And during their time, they didn't have protection. Elbow pads, knee pads, or special effects computers. They really surprised me. They did all their own crazy stunts. That's why I learned everything from them. So who is Harold Lloyd? Harold Lloyd is a legend of silent film. Throughout the 1900s, his death-defying climbing skills would be featured in films. A little bit later, we would have Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton would perform these hilarious gags which involved obstacles, climbs, and jumps. And then Charlie Chaplin would be the one to perfect the slapstick comedy style. Jackie Chan tells us that these were the basis of much of his inspiration, which is kind of interesting because all of these names are from Western culture. However, what we didn't hear in that little excerpt is about Jackie Chan's upbringing. Jackie Chan grew up in a boarding school for Beijing opera, where he learnt not only martial arts but performance arts, so dancing, singing, acting, all of that. This, combined with his expertise in acrobatics that he had learnt from Beijing opera, created a perfect recipe for the moment that he discovered his Western film idols. I looked all around the internet to find if Jackie Chan has ever directly talked about parkour, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like he has. The best I could find was Jackie Chan reacting to parkour clips on a TV show.
All right, let's see the first video.
If just one, he fell.
Jackie could tell by just looking at the person's body shape if they were going to land or if they were going to hurt themselves. Oh, and amazingly, he actually reviewed a clip from the Leeds parkour scene.
Let's go, Jackie. Let's see.
But other than that, I've never found a mention from Jackie Chan about parkour. In researching for this video, I actually spoke to Kyle Shapiro, who is a stuntman who has worked closely with Jackie Chan. He tells me that Jackie Chan is very much aware of parkour. Like, he knows what it is, he knows it's a discipline. But Kyle tells me Jackie probably wouldn't consider what he does parkour, but rather just being Jackie Chan. But hold up a second, you might be wondering, why am I not putting as much emphasis on Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, and the iconic John Ciampa, or however you say his name? All of those people were popular in films way before Jackie Chan was even born. So why am I trying to draw the link between Jackie Chan and parkour more so than the other guys? Well, there are two main reasons. Firstly, and we'll get into this in a second, I'm starting to see a lot of parallels between parkour and martial arts. Secondly, despite Buster Keaton inspiring Jackie Chan, there's no direct link between them inspiring David Bell and the Yamakasi. Not in their style, and most importantly, their philosophy.
L'ego, c'est l'ennemi du parcours. Je dirais que ça.
This is where things get really interesting. I touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but the Yamakasi are extremely important in establishing this link between parkour, martial arts, and Jackie Chan. To the point that it begs the question if parkour, at its roots, is a martial arts discipline. But maybe that's a video for another day. The Yamakasi was David Bell's parkour team, and in fact the first parkour team ever. Having a team in parkour is very common these days, mainly as a group of friends to train with. However, the Yamakasi were very different to the parkour brands of today, like Stora or Motus. Yamakasi as a word translates to strong in body, spirit, and person. The Yamakasi was a philosophy. Wikipedia tells us a bit about the Yamakasi and their approach to training. The group put themselves through challenges that forced them to find physical and mental strength to succeed. Examples including training without food or water, or sleeping on the floor without a blanket. The Yamakasi had this disciplined, almost martial arts style of training, with their focus being on building character and inner strength. In the book I mentioned earlier, Breaking the Jump, Julie tells us that a founding member of the Yamakasi, Jan Hanuratara, I don't know how to say it, come on, had a sadistic style of training normal exercises. And they would do each exercise an abnormal number of times. 1001 sit-ups a day was standard. Then they would punch stone walls like you see in kung fu films. The goal for them wasn't just to be strong physically, but rather to create a strong mind and character. This stands out to me as super interesting. Parkour as a discipline and a philosophy. To be in the Yamakasi wasn't about how good your running precision was, but rather about being a strong and humble individual. To be doing parkour meant not just to simply move, but the intention you had with your movement. This isn't usual. This isn't like skateboarding or BMX or any other extreme sport that would have been popular at the time that parkour started. This is a distinctly different philosophy. This philosophy is very similar to that of martial arts.
To me, okay, to me, ultimately, martial art means honestly expressing yourself. Now, it is very difficult to do.
But how did this philosophy around parkour start? Was it simply that the Yamakasi saw a few kung fu films and wanted to emulate it, or was it something more? Raymond Bell, father to David Bell, was of Vietnamese descent and grew up as an orphan in the Vietnamese city of Da Lat at age 7. It was in this military orphanage that Raymond Bell would sneak out at night to become better at the obstacle course they had there. He wanted to be better than everyone else. It was there where Raymond Bell became fixated on Georges Herbert's méthode de naturel. George had come up with méthode de naturel after studying the incredibly acrobatic movements of indigenous Africans. As George developed this idea, he brought it to the French military, and it was there where Raymond excelled on his course. Raymond handed this down to David Bell. But what is really interesting to note is Raymond's Vietnamese heritage. There were two other very important founders of the Yamakasi, who were Chow Bell and Williams Bell. Both of them, as their name suggests, were cousins to David Bell. All of them, they trained martial arts, as did their father, which would be David Bell's uncle. And there is a good chance that Raymond Bell, growing up as he did, would have probably learnt martial arts.
When we were young, David is my cousin. We start together. We create the group Yamakasi, Yamakasi means strong man, strong spirit, strong body.
David Bell himself spent 3 months in India studying Kung Fu. And when you see him in the video Speed Airman, which was the first ever parkour film made, the video starts with the sound of a gong. And you can see David Bell practicing some kind of chi in a very martial arts way. And it's also interesting to note the style in which Speed Airman was edited. Had parkour followed the extreme sports style, it would have probably been shot on a fisheye and had videos of them drinking beer. But it wasn't. It was edited in this kind of martial arts style. So we have 3 key inspirations for the foundation of parkour here. Firstly, this martial arts attitude of bettering and truly understanding yourself.
To express oneself honestly, not lying to oneself. That, my friend, is very hard to do, and you have to train. You have to keep your roots.
Combine that with George Hebert's be strong to be useful, être fort pour être utile, and finally Jackie Chan and Kung Fu cinema and TV. All of these incredibly important inspirations led a group of disaffected kids born in the concrete jungle of Lys to believe they could be superheroes. Superheroes who weren't imprisoned by this brutalist architecture that surrounded them. David Bell and the Yamakasi were Jackie Chan. They were Goku. They were Jean-Claude Van Damme. With strict discipline, but yet this freedom and love for movement. They became the heroes that they grew up watching on their TV screen. But better yet, they were heroes that existed in real life. But one question remains unanswered. Is Jackie Chan the true founder of parkour? Look, humans have been moving and doing parkour ever since the beginning of our species. And before that, if you look at animals, you see parkour all the time. Parkour, or should I say movement, it's in our blood. And it's a fundamental part of human beings that has existed far before Jackie Chan, David Bell, or Buster Keaton. Jackie Chan used his inspirations and his background to create a new style of movement, for sure. And his creations 100% inspired some of the Yamakasi. And you could even call what he was doing parkour. But I don't think I could confidently say he is the founder of the sport. At the end of the day, parkour as a packaged, trained discipline is rightfully that of David Bell and the Yamakasi. They defined it, they developed it, and they perfected it. Definitions and distinctions are what make things things. And without David and the Yamakasi, we wouldn't have the sport, or martial art, whatever you want to call it, that we know as parkour. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. A massive thank you to Travis Grant Lee and Carl Shapiro for helping me write this story. You can help support the future of this channel by buying a parkour bucket list on my website, supporting me on Patreon, or using my affiliate code in the sponsored link. Peace.